really appreciate the invite that I've been given to speak to you guys and engage the community here. I've titled the talk "The Corporatisation of Our Soil," but it kind of does no justice to the breadth of what we'll cover over the course of this little journey I'm hoping to take you guys on. So I'm kind of very honoured to be here, first of all, to present on what I think are the fundamentals of what's driving modern disease in our species. Modern disease, even in our industry, in medicine, is often called diseases of civilization. And I'm going to try and take you guys on this journey to explore what that means today and how that kind of links into agriculture and subsequently our soil. So that's me, with a great head of hair, and that's almost about 20 years ago. I've been a doctor for 20 years. I graduated in New Zealand. I was born in Sri Lanka, grew up in Africa, and I do believe to a certain extent I was fated to do medicine. I've always had an interest in logic and math, and somehow fell into medicine, and unfortunately as the years progressed in my industry I just failed to see the logic within it. So when I graduated in New Zealand as a doctor at 21, I moved over to Australia, and I've been here since. So nearly 22 years as a doctor here in Australia. So I became quite immersed and trained in it, and this was my path. But I was starting to realise that as doctors, that we trained in the management of disease, but not on health, which really is the absence of disease. So, I was a gastroenterologist, and that means that I'm a specialist on the gut, the digestive system basically. So the thought that I had was, surely what we put into our gut must contribute to our disease. Apparently this is a revolutionary thought in my industry. But in the last decade I've spent it with people that source their food with a short supply chain, hunters in particular, farmers, and people there that source their food. And I do believe I've fallen to great depths to understand disease, and during some of this journey I've kind of lost myself in it, because medicine becomes your identity. For a lot of my colleagues it's their entire ego. And so for me, I had to lose parts of it, and it wasn't really an easy journey. It's a deep tunnel. But I do believe it's only the lost that ever draw the map, for others. And I'm hopeful that I can do something within my industry that kind of helps others along the path. My industry considers disease an inevitability. Like it's a fundamental part of life. And conditions such as cancers, Alzheimer's, autoimmune illnesses, heart disease, all of these things are seeing explosive growth in the last half a century, in the last 50 years. And it's picked up quite dizzying pace in the last 2 decades. And the question one needs to ask is, if disease is an inevitability, then why now? Why is it now, as the crescendo within this civilization builds, do we get this bubbling forth of disease? In 1995, an American artist, Adam was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. It's a pretty difficult diagnosis for anyone, but before his death in 2007, he created a heart-wrenching set of self-portraits of himself, of the stages of Alzheimer's, which roughly lasted 5 years. He had rapid onset and rapidly progressive, and it documented the gradual decay of the mind. An incredible set of drawings which were displayed to medical students to kind of teach them what Alzheimer's disease is. And when you see things like this constantly as a doctor, and if you've got any ounce of empathy, this industry eventually ends up breaking your heart. And I witness it all the time in my colleagues. I think a lot of them are highly empathetic. They go into the industry to help people. They're not bad people, they're good people, but eventually it gets to a point where they see no way out apart from that which is presented to them by the pharmaceutical and device-based industry, and they struggle with it. You know, doctors struggle with high levels of suicide and depression and anxiety. That, you know, 60 to 70% of my industry suffers from metabolic disease, you know, which is the pre-diabetic stage. So we're not well as ourselves as doctors. And I was witnessing fragility and frailty everywhere. I became quite cynical and nihilistic in this industry. And you can see why. I mean, in the last, the causes of death in Australia over the last 4 decades, you just have to note that things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease were unheard of in 1977. And look at where they've risen, you know, and heart disease, the rates are absolutely staggering. So I hit midlife, you know, 40, and midlife is when you go inward and you start writing the chapters of your life. It was a great personal journey. I was in a great job, paid well. I had a lot of respect from my society and community. But despite a lot of those personal victories, it was a very empty feeling going home. Big void had opened up, and it really forced me to look around at my industry, and the veil slowly started lifting. And I was quite humbled by what I saw, actually, and I saw a workforce that was mentally, physically and emotionally pushed to the brink. Many, as I said before, in this industry themselves suffered ill health. And the stats from the Australian Medical Association suggested that most doctors will not allow their own children to do medicine. You know, like any craft that has ever been engineered in our civilization, one has always taken great pride in passing it on to our children. But here we are as an industry saying we wouldn't. The vast majority of us wouldn't pass it on to our children. This is certainly the same for me. You know, I wouldn't want my children to do medicine. So it says we're healthcare practitioners, but what we do has very little to do with health, everything to do with disease. Carl Jung, one of my favourite philosophers, he was a psychiatrist, a doctor like me, and he said, as far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light of meaning in the darkness of mere being. So knowing this, I kind of set out on a quest for answers. I turned actually to my own industry, the supposed professors and those credentialed to give me answers, a logical place to start. And I presented it to them. You know, I asked them, why are these diseases increasing? And I was told it's because we've gotten better. We're better as doctors. We've got better diagnostic capacity. We're diagnosing that which was not diagnosed. I was staggered with that rhetoric. It implied that as an industry that we were just improving. It was utter hubris. And a lot of my colleagues blamed genetic code. They said genetics is why we've got disease. It was an inevitability. It was weaved into our genetic code. It didn't sit well with me, and for diseases to rise in such an explosive trajectory, there's more to it. There's a lot more to it, you know. Some of these autoimmune diseases like Crohn's disease, celiac disease, multiple sclerosis, type 1, they were up 300 to 500%. Obesity up 300 to 500%, diabetes up 300% in 20 years. To blame it on genetics and improved diagnostic is actually gaslighting the population. I think that term gaslighting is overused, but this is a classic example of being gaslit as a patient. More accurate description is actually epigenetics. It's how, like, your environment, the external environment, communicates with your genetic code. To give you guys an example, I'll tell you something about a disease we call celiac disease. Everyone knows of it. It's common. You know, 50 years ago, it was unheard of. Those with celiac disease, or the genetics for celiac disease, are blessed. In a population that existed that drank contaminated water, ate contaminated meat before the advent of refrigeration, these people with these genetics were able to mount this amazing immune response to these external triggers. So essentially they had enhanced gut-based immunity. Now, here were these people launching a response to modern day wheat. So one has to beg the question, what does that tell you about modern day wheat? When the body treats it like it were a microorganism, like it was Campylobacter or some horrible microorganism that's invading your gastrointestinal tract. And this is what medicine failed to teach me. So philosophically, I look at it as if you break nature, you witness her sadness manifest through her children as disease. Her tears are basically our disease. But this was known, the father of medicine, Hippocrates. He said, do no harm, like as a doctor, do no harm, and all disease begins in the gut. That's from Hippocrates. That's from thousands of years ago. So a logical place for a gastroenterologist to start, when we're assessing this sort of thing, is to ask, where does our food come from? And that's what I started doing. I started asking, what is nutrition? Nutrition, basically, I don't need to kind of preach to the choir here, you guys are all well aware, it's the study of the need for the building blocks of life, vitamins, minerals, amino acids, fats, glucose. It comes from our earth, our soil, basically. So my field as a gastroenterologist is quite unique because what's grown on the soil is what meets the human being through the gut. I was at the interface of something quite special, the meeting between agriculture and medicine or health. And, I've seen a lot of people in my been a doctor for 20 years, but a specialist for over 13 years, and I'm starting to realise the brilliance of Hippocrates, and modern medicine is slowly starting to recognise the concept of how important the gut is and how that relates to health. In the pursuit of an ultra-processed way of eating, right, if we're going to select for a way that we eat in an ultra-processed way, these are these foods that are highly refined, our cereals, our fast foods, our everything that we see in the supermarket, in most of the aisles, that's ultra-processed food, packeted, preservatives, God knows what, That way of eating has to change farming, right? The diversified farms, such as the ones we see in Danthonia, have to give way to genetically uniform one type of crop. It's quite interesting. The first time I drove into Danthonia with my wife and my children, I witnessed the stark paradox, this beautiful, vibrant farm, yet leading into it was the monocrop systems, the sunflower and the wheat and so forth. And it was quite clear to me that this place was, it was a jewel. It was a jewel, and they're trying to do something that mankind has done for a long time. And they're trying to bring back something that's become a relic of our history. So when you drive past these farms and you see these row upon row of one type of crop, that's normal to us now because we live in the era of monocrop systems. And these are these fields planted one type of crop or one species at a time, corn, wheat, soy, over a very large area. And that doesn't happen in nature, because nature herself, she favours diversity. And diversity helps with pests and weeds. We lost diversity, so we had to replace that with huge surges in pesticide and subsequently fertiliser during this period. Farmers then became reliant on this chemical-based agriculture. Pharmaceutical use became rampant. Antibiotics, for instance, they were introduced to animals in 1940s and 50s after they found that feeding the drug caused them to gain weight faster on less feed. Now 80% of the antibiotic drugs sold in the US are not for us, not for men and women and children, but for livestock production. So what does chemical-based agriculture do to the soil? The microbiome of the soil is everything for the plant. It harnesses this from the soil, the plant does. The plant itself is almost a farmer. It It farms the microbiome to regulate its own nutrition and health. And the soil harbours the greatest, the most diverse and complex microbiome on Earth. Like when you talk about microbiome, the Earth is it. That is the biggest biobank of the microbiome. However, when you start exposing farms to the wastes of animals that have had chronic antibiotic exposure because they're fed through feedlots and agrochemicals such as pesticides, then you start damaging the nature of the soil. So really, I've come to the conclusion that human health correlates with planetary diversity. And these pesticides such as Bayer's glyphosate are themselves weak antibiotics. And over time, the diversity of this enormous microbiome bank degrades. You know, we're essentially stripping that bank of its assets. And given that we ourselves, as men and women, we reflect the soil's microbiome, our microbiome degenerates. Now, it's become super fashionable to use probiotics, and this industry is hugely profitable, worth billions. And the claim is that we can help the declining diversity of our own gut by taking probiotics. But that, to me, I'm yet to see evidence that it's clinically effective. So we've got a mess. I mean, we've got to admit we've got a mess. The biggest agribusiness that we've got in the world is Bayer's Monsanto, Roundup, glyphosate, many names, you know. This is the same chemical or similar chemical with a few modifications that was used on the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War to shrink the foliage. It's called Agent Orange. To this day, in Vietnam, they're still plagued with the birth defects that still result. You know, horrific, gruesome birth defects where Agent Orange's use was rampant. Yet they are now the biggest agribusiness in the world. Not only that, they're one of the biggest drug companies in the world. Bayer's owned by glyphosate. That level of corporatism and crony capitalism, it's difficult to fathom. It's difficult to fathom, and we as a public are completely unaware of it. Maybe not those of you in this room. Obviously, you guys are, you know, you're connected. You're in these rural communities, but I'm from the urban community, and I can tell you right now, in the urban communities, there is no awareness. Absolutely, there's so much disconnect as to where their food comes from. And I witnessed that real time in COVID as we saw food disappear from the shelves. Even now, they've got eggs disappearing from the shelves. And they're at a loss to explain why that is, because they think food disappears on the shelves. But we, in these communities that farm, know that food appears through the soil. And so there's this huge urban-rural disconnect. It's like you guys are, there's two different species, you know. I'm not sure you're speaking the same language anymore. A lot of people that I meet, actually even today, I went into a shop to buy something and I had a chat to this young lady in Armidale, and she said she trained and studied in Sydney. She said she'd never go back to Sydney, you know, and that's sort of the feeling that I get from a lot of people in these rural communities, that cities are not some places that they ideally want to exist. So there's a disconnect, not only with you guys, but from them. They believe urban communities are where they want to be, and they no longer want to exist in rural communities. So there's a disconnect. Two sets of, you know, people existing in silos. So it's a mess. We need to change, right? But there's a huge resistance to change because a small number of these giant multinational seed, crop, food companies have got this huge market share, right? And these giants buy out smaller competitors. Once you've eliminated competitors as a corporate entity, you've no longer got a free market. You can't compete, right? There's no healthy competition. And this type of market concentration stuffs everything for farmers and consumers. So you get these dominant companies gaining greater and greater power. to dictate how food is produced, leaving farmers with very little choice how to grow crops or raise animals. I mean, that's kind of replicating what I've talked about, but you know, this sort of monocrop system, you get a lot of fertiliser, you get nutrient imbalances, massive soil threat, land degradation, loss of biodiversity in the soil, you get the microbiome diversity lost in the human gut. So loss of diversity in the human gut, my industry calls dysbiosis. Very few gastroenterologists talk about dysbiosis, but it exists. It's a scientific entity. Antibiotics, other medicines, stress, you know, like even stress affects your gut microbiome. Genetic factors, nutrition, lifestyle, loss of contact with nature, all of that contributes to a microbiome that's disordered. When you disorder the gut microbiome, you lead to chronic, recurrent, inflammatory diseases. When you start getting maternal dysbiosis, you pass on the dysbiosis to your child. And this leads to something called altered vertical transfer. The baby inherits the mother's gut microbiome. So our great-grandmothers had great gut microbiomes. Our grandmothers had good microbiomes. Our mothers have got decent microbiomes, and our children are really compromised. It's intergenerational. So it's cumulative too. And there's some great studies done, not so much on humans, but on rats that show, I mean, I'll give you guys an example of a great study that was done on rats, where they found that you could take a generation of rats, expose them to Roundup. They had no effect from it, no problems. They bred them. That next generation that followed had a few health issues, but they were not exposed to Roundup at all during their entire course of lifetime, but had health issues. The generation that followed, never exposed to Roundup, had even worse health issues, and the generation that followed was the worst, right? So it was almost like the third generation copped it despite not being exposed to the Roundup where the great-grandparents were. So it's very interesting that these things have effects that we can't necessarily fathom within our lifetime. But you turn to government, surely, you know, government's got our best interests at heart. You know, I'm sure they'll tell us if glyphosate's a friend or foe, you know, I'm sure they'll do that. But the current assessment is that products containing glyphosate are safe to use according to label instructions. And this, as I'm sure proud Australians, should show you that your state is in bed with corporate entities that then subsequently use science or technocrats to influence policy. This is a merger between state and corporation, which is the fundamental definition of fascism. Fascism. Mussolini and Hitler's fascist state. This is the actual definition of it. The merger between state and corporation. Fascism. The amount of glyphosate being urinated by our people has increased in the last 20 to 30 years by about 1,300%, right? 1,300%, that's 13 times, right? 99%, this was a study done in France, 99% of the French population had glyphosate in their urine. 80% of the USA had glyphosate in their urine. How much for Australia? I think it'd be pretty similar to America. Our modes of farming are probably not too dissimilar. The farmers have the greatest excretion of glyphosate. I had a farmer last year, he's a wheat farmer, a lovely guy from the Mudgee or Orange area. He's 45, He presented with a lot of gut symptoms. I did an endoscopy on him, had a stomach cancer, spread everywhere, in his mid-40s. And he said to me, he said, "Pran, what have I done wrong? I've not got a family history of bowel cancer or any cancers, nothing. Yet I've had a melanoma in my 30s, I've had prostate cancer in my early 40s, and now I've got metastatic stomach cancer, and it's spread everywhere. What have I done wrong?" He's a wheat farmer. His use of glyphosate is enormous. It's enormous. And, you know, in countries like America and certain places in Europe, Bayer, the company that owns glyphosate, has already paid billions to farmers that have developed malignancy or cancers from this horrible chemical. In Australia, about 800 farmers that had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is a disease or a cancer of the lymph nodes, took them to High Court. The judge threw it out, saying there was just simply no evidence, and maybe when evidence becomes available. So those farmers that have developed malignancy from this chemical were simply gaslit by the system. So the question is, how does glyphosate actually affect us? You know, I'll tell you guys something interesting. If you take an 80 kilogram or 90 kilogram man like myself, right, I might have about 50 trillion cells that belong to me. You know, my muscle cell, my heart cells, skin cells, hair cells. Probably hair cells is a wrong example to use. But about 50 trillion Pran cells. Within my colon exists my microbiome. There is 75 trillion bacteria within the colon. So I philosophically and objectively am more bacteria and fungi than I am man. That's a huge statement. You know, it appears that I've got this consciousness, this awareness that allows me to interact in this creation that we inhabit using this avatar of my body, but my body seems to be propped up by something that comes from the soil, the fungi and bacteria from the soil. I am more soil at a physical level than I am man. That was a huge realisation for me. You know, our awareness, that's our consciousness, that's a separate story, but the actual physical system appears to be coming from Earth. We come from Earth. And that apparently is a revolutionary thought. It shouldn't be. We are made, Carl Sagan said it beautifully, right? We're made of star stuff. Within my blood courses iron. I carry iron in my red blood cells that comes from dying stars. My bones are made of calcium that comes from dying stars. Like, we're made of the universe. So when you put in something like glyphosate, which 60%, like that's what this figure shows, 55 to 60% of our gut microbiome is sensitive to glyphosate. Glyphosate is actually a weak antibiotic, right? So this is what's happening. 80% of our diet comes from grain. We're highly dependent on grain, in cities in particular. I see it. And so we've got this chronic ingestion of this antibiotic. And this is why we've got these sort of gut issues, and this is why, as a business perspective, we've been very successful as gastroenterologists. The environment is poisoned. And this over time, I won't go into too much detail here, leads to something called leaky gut or intestinal permeability. And you can see it real time with something called confocal endomicroscopy, where we can actually put in a camera or an endoscope which has got a microscope in it in experimental settings, and you can actually see dye leaking from what we consume into our bodies. It shouldn't. The gut should be this impenetrable barrier, yet the dye that we put in experimentally leaks into the body. So it shows that our guts are what we call leaky. You know, naturopaths have talked about this for decades, and my industry sort of rubbished that, but we're starting to recognise it. So, you know, like what should be Fort Knox, you know, impenetrable, is like this sort of house which has no security. This is off topic, but the last time an audit on gold was done in Fort Knox was in 1963. Yeah, so it'd be interesting to see what happened to the gold reserves in Fort Knox. There's a lot of talk that that might not exist, but it gives you an example just on a picture perspective as to what the gut should look like. It should be impenetrable, yet unfortunately it's penetrable. So, like, does Roundup accumulate in things like meat? Actually, to simplify, the meat's a filter. So, glyphosate inhibits an enzyme you call the Shikimate pathway, right? It's not present in animals, but it's present in plants and also present in bacteria in our gut. So when you expose animals to glyphosate, it doesn't necessarily, that includes us, it doesn't necessarily affect our muscle, which is the muscle we eat, obviously, is beef and sheep and whatever, but it affects the gut microbiome. So meat, which has been vilified for God knows how many decades, right? Red meat in particular, we're told it causes heart disease, it causes Alzheimer's, autoimmune disease, it causes bowel cancer. Your own government tells you that through institutions like the Bowel Cancer Society of Australia, or whatever they're called, and so you're constantly fed this messaging that meat's bad for you. But the reality is meat's probably some of the healthiest foods left. So glyphosate does not bioaccumulate in mammalian meat. And, you know, like meat, from what I've seen, has actually saved a lot of my patients' lives. You know, the ability to add in meat has saved their lives. But, as I said before, red meat is synonymous with cancer. World Health Organization classifies it a carcinogen. You know, and if I showed you some of the data, you guys would be shocked, objectively. They all sat down in 2015, a bunch of technocrats. Technocrats are those that use science to determine governance. So in 2019, when we were all told to put masks on and stay at home, these were the technocrats that handed out this sort of advice, utilising science as the weapon. We now know, right, that advice was not justified. It was not based on evidence. Yet the media parroted it. We ate it up, and we all put our masks on and stayed at home. Well, most of us in the cities anyway. When I came out to my farm here in Tinga, my farmer mates laughed at me. They said they've not been under those sort of restrictions at all. They've been enjoying life on the farm, and you know, and they've had the freedom. But in the cities, certainly we were burdened by that technocratic decision, which was handed out by scientists. Science being weaponised. It was a 22-member working group, all self-nominated. Most of them were militant vegans that had spent their life trying to prove that meat was problematic, and they volunteered to sit down with this group, and they evaluated about 800 studies, epidemiological studies. Epidemiology in science is the weakest form of science. Randomised control is the strongest form of science. But they looked at 800 crappy studies. 7 out of the 14 showed red meat might cause an issue. 12 out of the 18 studies of processed meat showed that maybe it increased colorectal cancer. So take that into account. 800 studies, and maybe a handful of them possibly showed that these things might cause disease. The vast majority, almost 750 of these studies, showed no evidence, no link. Yet they focused in on these poor quality studies And from that, right, they said that if you eat, they came up with this conclusion that if you eat 50 grams of processed meat every day, your relative risk of bowel cancer was increased by 18% compared to those that ate the least processed meat. All from very, very poor quality evidence, right? Using very poor quality standard of research, which is epidemiology, when the vast majority of the epidemiology did not show that link. So how does that figure of 18% compare with other known carcinogens? Carcinogens are things that cause cancer, right? So if we were to look at smoking and lung cancer, we all know smoking causes lung cancer. You know, the relative risk of, sorry, I'll go back to this. There's something called aflatoxin. It increases your risk of liver cancer. Smoking increases risk of lung cancer. The increased relative risk of lung cancer from smoking cigarettes is 300%. From eating mouldy grains contaminated with this toxin, liver cancer goes up, you know, the risk goes up by 600%. So that's what real risk looks like, right? Not 18%. And in fields outside of nutrition, the usual threshold for confidence about relative risk is you've got to be in the range of about 200 to 400% for it to be significant. So when you've got a relative risk of 200%, it means it doubles your risk. So really an increase of 18% increases relative risk by 1.18. This score is substantially outside the threshold of what any decent scientist should accept as worthy of causality. How do you accept that? We don't know. I mean, we hear it in the news, right? The media says, well, bowel cancer risk is increased significantly by eating red meat. And that's for processed meat that it goes up by 18%. How about for grass-fed finished steaks? I mean, they extrapolated it to all of this and lumped processed meat and proper non-processed meat in the same category. The lifetime risk for lifetime absolute risk of bowel cancer in vegetarians is 4.5 out of 100 people. So out of 100 people in one's lifetime, about 4.5 vegetarians will develop bowel cancer. In people eating 50 grams of processed meat every day for a lifetime, the risk is 5.3 out of 100. They're not distinguishable, right? You've got to be very wary of the media when they put out these percentages, because what they're using is they're weaponizing science to pass out something called relative risk. Relative risk. Always look at absolute risk, and when you look at those figures, you'll see it. I mean, imagine being concerned about eating bacon every day because of that sort of minuscule risk, absolutely minuscule risk. And you've got to remember something. There is a certain type of person that eats 50 grams of processed meat every day. These are the sort of people that are probably eating pepperoni pizzas and having milkshakes with their pepperoni pizzas and smoking, etc. There's a lot of confounding factors. Most people don't tend to do that if they've got healthy behaviours. We tend to go or gravitate towards unprocessed meat. So from that sort of rubbish data, we've got meat-free weeks from Bowel Cancer Australia. You know, that's promoted in August, and you know, there's a lot of virtue signalling in the cities about it. I'm not sure if you guys follow it here in rural communities. You know, Cancer Council's told parents not to pack ham in the kids' lunch boxes. I'm not sure if you guys follow that here. But, you know, certainly in my kids' schools in the cities, they are teaching the kids that meat causes cancer. My kids come and tell me all the time. And not only does meat cause cancer, it causes climate change, apparently, and various other things. And, you know, you've got people like Bill Gates that are respected by the highly educated, and he's telling them to switch to things like synthetic beef. But what cost does synthetic beef have on the monocrop systems? Imagine the inputs needed to grow these plants like soy or chickpeas or lentils, whatever they do, to generate these sort of fake meats or plant-based meats. It's incredible. And now you've got this type of plant-based lifestyles, which are very, very common in urban communities, and it's being pushed out that it's imperative for survival. I'm surprised that this current cyclone that's unfolding hasn't been blamed on you farmers sitting in the crowd. I'm actually surprised that link hasn't been made. And it's just everywhere. I mean, it's just everywhere. You just have to open your eyes to the media or the legacy media to know that type of indoctrination is widespread. So, and it's in our curriculum. They're teaching the kids this, so it's incredible. So, I'll quickly go through these slides. I'm going to talk about corporatisation. There's something called corporatisation, and let's take the military-industrial complex, and we'll see this play out in real time over the next few years as we head into what is an engineered war in the context of a declining currency, which is brought on by central bank-based printing or theft. But essentially, when you've got a relationship between a country's military and the defence industry, then you've got a vested interest in something, and that then subsequently influences public policy. So you've got Congress, you've got tax funding to the Department of Defence. The Department of Defence then issues tax-funded contracts, which are picked up by the Raytheons and the Lockheed Martins, these big industrial military complexes, and that money then goes back to Congress. It's just money changing hands. And, war's money. And Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, as he departed, warned about the military-industrial complex. And not to, go through the entire quote, but he essentially said we have to be very, very careful, because if we don't watch this military-industrial complex, it's going to have unwarranted influence, and there is potential for disaster, basically. So in medicine, in my industry, I'm part of this industrial complex. It's called the toxic triad, or the pharmaceutical, medical, industrial complex. It's big food, which is basically big agriculture, right? So that's how we, in this farming communities, link it, which then creates disease, which is big medicine. I pick that up. I then employ the corporate entities, which are big pharma, and you've got this triangle. And, this was all taken on by, this is all called the business of disease, and that was all brought to light by John D. Rockefeller. He's literally the father of modern medicine, he had this vision for American medicine. Prior to that, medicine was just a jumble of competing philosophy, like George Washington, President George Washington, as he lay dying, all these countries' best physicians, from Harvard and Yale in the 1800s, proceeded to kill him. They gave him, put leeches on him and gave him heaps of doses of mercury subchloride. So it's like the wild, wild west of healthcare. So John D. Rockefeller comes and he sees an opportunity, and he standardised it. So he came up with a curriculum, and all these beautiful natural therapies, not so much the mercury subchloride and the leeches, but all these natural therapies that we had gave way to allopathic medicine. And allopathic medicine is brilliant. Like, the invention of penicillin has made a huge difference to our species. We've revolutionised healthcare with it, but unfortunately we've tipped over the edge, and we've had excellent things like surgery, MRI, CT scanning, but we've lost a lot of things like food, exercise, spiritual health, and so in the midst of all of this allopathic medicine, we've lost some of the natural systems. And as doctors, definitely we've lost our way in terms of the fundamentals of healthcare. And, you know, Marsha D'Angelo, one of my own, she's a doctor, she's the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. She said that, you know, she said the pharmaceutical industry basically stands in the way of US Congress, FDA, medical centres and the medical profession itself. She warned of it as she departed. And so medicine now is guided more by marketing than clinical consideration. The money of this industry buys the best statisticians, epidemiologists, and they design these studies in a way that they already know the result before they put it to you. And when they put it to you, they put it to you as the relative risk. So they say this drug reduces disease by 90%. And we take that on 90%. Wow, that's a huge number. But as I've proven to you, 90% is bugger all when you look at the absolute risk. Absolute versus relative risk. Please go away and kind of really cement that. Absolute versus relative risk. It's important. You'll see through the media when you do that. And, you know, the pharmaceutical industry spends more money promoting to doctors than the entire budget of medical schools. I mean, that should tell you volumes. They don't care. They genuinely don't care. So it's on us. We need to rise. There's something called the Plato's allegory of the cave. You know, Plato, brilliant thinker. He said, this is a brilliant allegory, and he said, mankind, we're born into captivity, in a cave. Right? We're born into this cave. And we're chained to the cave, and that's our surroundings. In front of us there's a wall, that's the only thing we can see. Behind us are the puppeteers of our reality. Using the flame, they project these images which we stare at, and we think that's our reality. You know? And for me, the puppeteers of this society, the people that truly run this, use the flame of media to project the reality that we think is true onto this cave wall, and we eat that up. Now, should a man escape from that top of the pits of that hell, which is that cave, to the surface and actually observe the surface of reality, he would see reality for what it is. And if he went back down, well, he'd be laughed at, you know, and eventually if he pushed hard enough, they would kill him. So, in summary, guys, the soil and us, we're one. We reflect the earth. We deserve sound food, like the food that we've eaten today. Everyone deserves that, you know, and they should eat to nourish their bodies, because it gives the bodies the things that we experience are the bits of divine technology that we get to experience this creation through. And that's a glorious thing. Unfortunately, in this modern world, we've traded in surplus of calories for a declining quality of calories. We moved away from these ancestral methods of farming and hunting and so forth. So to fix our health, we really have to fix the soil. As my message grew louder, I was slowly being cut off from the medical industry. You know, they think I'm a bit of a nut. But I've found that the regenerative farmers, they've actually welcomed my message. It's been quite a humbling experience to go down that pathway. You know, I've met a lot of good regenerative farmers in this journey, and I don't think the pharmaceutical and medical industry is going to restore the wastelands of human health. I actually think the farmers will. I think this whole destruction of the planet aspect that they think they can fix with wind farms and solar farms, I don't think they will. I think our farmers will fix that. So God bless all of you. I'm not here to preach or teach you anything. I'm just here to kind of express my support and love for all of you. I've fallen into farming. If I'm going to talk about farming, I'm going to do it. I'm not very good at it, but I'm learning all the time. But what I'm practicing is a regenerative form of medicine. It's not too dissimilar to what the farmers are trying to do. We're trying to take something that's essentially hurt, which is the soil in the case of the farmers, and for me it's
it's man and woman, and we're trying to regenerate that. So agriculture and medicine are colliding, and it's a beautiful collision. Thank you.